The weight of the starched black apron was a familiar burden on Maya Flores' hips, a constant reminder of the life she was living versus the one she was supposed to have. Each night it felt heavier, infused with the ghosts of spilled wine, the scent of other people's expensive perfumes, and the crushing gravity of her reality. Her world, once a sun-drenched courtyard in Seville, alive with the stories of her abuela, was now the polished marble floor of Solstice, Miami's most obscenely luxurious rooftop restaurant. Solstice wasn't just a place to eat, it was a stage for the city's elite. The patrons were the glittering cast, draped in silks and jewels, their laughter echoing the clink of ice in $1,000 cocktails. The staff, including Maya, were the stagehands, meticulously trained in the art of invisibility. Maya had become a master. She could navigate the labyrinth of tables, her tray held high, a serene mask of professional deference fixed on her face. She could anticipate the need for a water refill before a glass was half empty and decipher a mumbled order over the din of a stock market victory celebration. She was efficient, silent, and to the people she served, utterly forgettable. Tonight, the Miami air, usually thick with salt and possibility, was charged with a different kind of energy inside Solstice. A colossal real estate deal was being finalized in the restaurant's most coveted private space, the Celestial Terrace. Her manager, a perpetually sweating man named Mr. Klein, had cornered her by the service station earlier, his voice a nervous squeak. "Flores," he'd whispered, wiping his brow with a linen napkin. "The Croft party, on the terrace. This isn't just another dinner. This is Julian Croft. Do you understand what that means?" Maya understood. Even if you didn't read the business pages, you knew Julian Croft. He wasn't a person. He was a force of nature, a hurricane of development that had reshaped the city's skyline. His face, sharp and predatory, was a fixture on magazine covers, usually under headlines like The Concrete King or Croft's Conquest. He was infamous for his brutal efficiency, buying up historical properties and replacing them with gleaming, soulless towers of glass and steel. He was a man who saw tradition as an obstacle and sentiment as a weakness. To Maya, he was just another name on a reservation list. A difficult customer, certainly, but her goal was singular: survive the shift. Survival was the engine that drove her every move. After her shift, she'd take 2 buses back to the small, humid bungalow in Little Havana that she shared with her grandmother, Elena. Elena, a woman whose hands had once commanded the respect of Spain's most powerful legal minds, now spent her days in a faded armchair, her world circumscribed by the 4 walls of their living room. A stroke years ago had stolen the brilliant clarity from her eyes and the swiftness from her tongue, leaving behind a fog of confusion that came and went like the tide. The doctors called it vascular dementia. It was a cruel, slow-motion thief, demanding a constant supply of expensive medications and therapies that Maya's meager earnings could barely sustain. The weight of the apron wasn't just fabric. It was the cost of Elena's medicine, the overdue rent, the suffocating fear of the next medical bill. As she meticulously polished a row of wine glasses, her reflection a ghostly figure in the gleaming crystal. Maya's mind drifted. She remembered a different life, a life vibrant with color and sound. She remembered her abuela, Elena, not as she was now, but as she had been. Elena hadn't been a professor or an artist. She had been a lioness, one of the most sought-after legal translators in Madrid, specializing in complex international contracts. Her home was not filled with art, but with towering stacks of documents, the air thick with the smell of old paper and strong coffee. Elena had taught Maya Spanish, but not the kind you learn in a classroom. It was the Spanish of contracts, of loopholes and liabilities, of clauses designed to protect and clauses designed to deceive. "El diablo está en los detalles, mi corazón," she would say, her finger tracing a line of dense text. "The devil is in the details, my heart." She taught Maya to read not just the words, but the space between them, the intent behind the ink. Their bedtime stories were tales of corporate battles won and lost over a single misplaced comma, of fortunes saved by a well-worded indemnity clause. She had given Maya a peculiar gift, an X-ray vision for the written word. the ability to see the skeleton of power and greed beneath the flesh of legal jargon. Then their world had been razed to the ground. Maya's father, an American businessman who had fallen for the brilliant Spanish translator, had entered a partnership to develop a boutique hotel in Miami. He had trusted his partners, signing a contract he believed was ironclad. But the devil had been in the details, in a subclause written in dense Castilian legal Spanish that Elena, weakened by the first signs of her illness, had not been there to vet. The partners triggered the clause, pushed her father out, and drained their life savings. The betrayal broke him. A heart attack, sudden and final, claimed him a year later. They lost everything: the comfortable home, the savings, the future. Maya, who had been studying international business, a path chosen to follow in her parents' footsteps, had to drop out. Her specialized knowledge of contract law and her fluency in its most arcane dialect were now only useful for memorizing the day's specials in 2 languages. A sharp, impatient clap echoed from across the room, yanking her from the past. A man at a corner table was frowning, gesturing irritably at his empty water glass. "My apologies, sir," she murmured, her cheeks burning as she rushed over with a pitcher. She was losing her edge. Mr. Klein's warning replayed in her mind. Not tonight. She took a deep, steadying breath, shoving the memories back into the locked chest in her heart, where she kept her grief. She was not Maya Flores, the granddaughter of a legal prodigy. She was server number 17, and the Croft party was about to descend upon the celestial terrace. She straightened her apron, the familiar weight a grounding force, and braced herself for the storm. The private elevator to the celestial terrace opened with a soft, expensive whoosh, and the ambient energy of the restaurant shifted. Conversations at nearby tables momentarily paused. Julian Croft didn't just enter a room, he annexed it. He was a tall man, not handsome in a classic sense, but possessing an aura of raw, coiled power that was magnetic and terrifying in equal measure. He wore a bespoke navy suit that fit him like a second skin, a garment that cost more than Maya made in 6 months. His hair was silver at the temples, a distinguished touch that did nothing to soften the predatory glint in his cold, slate-blue eyes. Those eyes swept the terrace with a look of profound impatience, as if the stunning panoramic view of the Miami skyline was a trivial distraction from the business at hand. At his side were 2 younger men in identical dark suits, his legal team, their faces a mixture of admiration and fear. Clinging to his arm was a woman who looked like she'd been sculpted from glass and gold. Candace, a model whose face was a familiar fixture on Instagram feeds, her smile as bright and vacant as a camera flash. Maya's focus, however, was drawn to the 2 men who followed a half-step behind Croft. They were older, likely in their late 60s, with the kind of sun-weathered skin and thoughtful eyes that spoke of a life spent creating, not just acquiring. They were dressed in impeccably tailored linen suits that were stylish but understated. Unlike Croft, who vibrated with a restless, conquering energy, these men moved with a deliberate grace. They surveyed the architecture of the restaurant, not with a developer's assessing gaze, but with an artist's appreciation. Maya recognized the quiet confidence of old-world masters, men for whom reputation was built over generations, not fiscal quarters. These, she knew, were the reason for this summit. Mr. Klein scurried forward, his smile stretched so wide it looked painful. "Mr. Croft, welcome. Everything is prepared for you. The celestial terrace is yours for the evening." Croft barely acknowledged him, already striding towards the best table, a sprawling banquette overlooking the glittering expanse of Biscayne Bay. As his entourage passed Maya's station, his cold gaze slid over her for less than a second. It wasn't a look of dismissal. It was a look of complete non-perception. To him, she was an object, a functional piece of the restaurant's machinery. Candace, in contrast, gave her a slow, deliberate look, a condescending appraisal from head to toe that was meant to highlight the vast gulf between their stations in life. Maya felt the familiar clench of indignation in her gut, but kept her expression placid, her posture perfect. She had served men who thought they were gods before. It was part of the job. "Flores," Mr. Klein hissed, rushing back from the terrace. "Get over there, now! Remember, they get whatever they want. Don't interrupt. Don't make them wait. And for the love of all that is holy, don't make a mistake." She nodded, her hands steady as she lifted her silver tray with menus and a bucket of iced champagne. Her pulse quickened as she approached the terrace. She could already hear Croft's voice, a low baritone that cut through the night air, talking about zoning permits and demolition schedules. She stepped onto the terrace. The setting was breathtaking, a private oasis under the stars. The table was set with exquisite perfection. Croft was already seated, holding court. Candace was looking at her phone, while the lawyers sat rigidly, notebooks at the ready. The two older gentlemen, whom Croft introduced with curt efficiency as Ricardo and Mateo Castillo, sat opposite him, their faces polite but unreadable. Maya moved with the silent grace of a dancer, placing menus before each guest. When she reached Croft, he waved a hand impatiently, not even looking up. "I'll have a Macallan 25 neat, and we'll be ordering later. We have business to discuss first." He then fixed his gaze on the Castillo brothers. "Gentlemen, as my team explained, this letter of intent is a simple formality, a gesture of goodwill to lock in our partnership before we proceed to the full draft." One of his lawyers slid a slim, leather-bound folder across the table. Ricardo, the elder of the two brothers, held up a hand. He had a kind face, with deep lines etched around his eyes. "Mr. Croft," he said, his English precise and accented with the soft lisp of Castilian Spanish. "With all respect, in our family, there is no such thing as a simple formality. Every word committed to paper has weight." He opened the folder. Inside was a single elegant sheet of paper, but it was covered in dense, single-spaced text. Maya noticed from a distance that the main body of the text was in Spanish, with a smaller English translation below it. The Castillo brothers began to read, their heads bent together, murmuring to each other in low, rapid Spanish. The sound of it, the formal, intricate Spanish of their profession, was a key turning a lock in Maya's memory. It was the language of her abuela's life, the language of power and precision. Croft's leg began to bounce under the table. His patience was a finite resource, and it was draining rapidly. "Gentlemen," he cut in, his voice tight, "it's a standard LOI. My lawyers have assured me the Spanish is a direct, certified translation of the English. It just outlines the acquisition of the land, the construction timeline, and our profit-sharing model. We can have our people hammer out the finer points next week." Mateo, the younger brother, looked up. He had the intense, focused eyes of an artist. "The finer points, Mr. Croft, are often where the soul of a project is found, or where it is lost." The brothers continued their quiet discussion, pointing to specific phrases, their brows furrowed in concentration. The atmosphere grew thick with Croft's barely suppressed irritation. He saw their diligence not as professionalism, but as obstruction, as an insult. He wanted their name, the Castillo architectural legacy, to give his soulless luxury tower a veneer of artistic credibility. They, it seemed, were more interested in protecting that legacy. His frustration needed a target, and his eyes landed on Maya, who stood waiting silently a few feet away. Candace, sensing his mood, decided to contribute. She let out a sigh that was pure performance. "Julian, darling," she cooed, placing a hand on his arm. "They're taking forever. It's just a piece of paper." She glanced at Maya with a smirk. "It's probably as complicated as a dinner receipt. I'm sure even she could figure it out." The insult was designed to amuse Croft, to create a shared moment of superiority. The lawyers offered weak, sycophantic chuckles. Croft's lips twisted into a cruel smile. He saw an opportunity to vent his frustration and reassert his dominance. He picked up a copy of the document and held it out in Maya's direction, though he didn't look at her. He spoke to the Castillo brothers, his voice dripping with condescension, as if Maya were a prop in his demonstration of their absurdity. "You see, this is what I'm talking about. We're wasting the most valuable commodity in the world. My time, poring over details. It's a simple document." He shook the paper for emphasis, his voice rising. "How complicated can it be? We're being held up by a piece of paper that this girl—" He finally deigned to look at her, his eyes like chips of ice. "This waitress couldn't even begin to understand. Hell," He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. What's the point of the Spanish translation anyway? It's not like she can even read the receipt. The words struck Maya with the force of a physical slap. He had not just dismissed her, he had vaporized her. In that single brutal sentence, he had rendered her entire history, her intellect, her very humanity, invisible. He had defined her by her apron, by the station in life he assigned to her. She stood frozen, the city lights blurring behind a sudden film of tears. All she could see was his smug, powerful face, the face of a man who bulldozed worlds and people with equal indifference. And in that moment, something deep inside her, a dormant, sleeping lioness inherited from her abuela, began to stir. It was the part of her that had watched her father's spirit crumble, the part that cared for her brilliant grandmother now lost in a fog, the part that had swallowed injustice after injustice, day after weary day. Elena's voice echoed in her mind, a phrase she had repeated 1,000 times. La tinta más pobre vale más que la mejor memoria. The palest ink is worth more than the best memory. It meant everything must be examined. Everything mattered. Her fate was not to stand here and be erased. Her peculiar gift was not meant to be buried under a mountain of grief and unpaid bills. She lifted her chin. Her eyes, which had been downcast in the trained deference of her job, met Julian Croft's gaze. The serene mask crumbled, and for the first time that night, the fire within her was visible. She took a slow, deliberate breath, and a profound silence fell over the celestial terrace. The city's hum seemed to fade into the background. She was about to speak. The air on the terrace was taut, stretched thin by Julian Croft's casual cruelty. The Castillo brothers exchanged a look of profound discomfort. They were men of a different era, a different culture, where public humiliation, especially of someone in a service position, was a mark of poor breeding. But they were on foreign soil, in the middle of a delicate negotiation. Croft, however, relished the tension. He thrived in it. He saw the world as a food chain, and he was at the very top. He wasn't just being cruel, he was demonstrating power, showing the Castillos that he commanded his environment absolutely. See, gentlemen, he pressed on, enjoying his own performance. It's simple. Let's sign the damn thing and order some wine. I'm buying. Ricardo Castillo, ever the gentleman, tried to diffuse the situation. He addressed Maya directly, his tone soft and apologetic, as if to include her in a circle of civility that Croft had drawn her out of. Señorita, please forgive the intensity of our discussion, but Maya's attention was no longer on Ricardo's kindness. It was fixed on the document in Croft's hand, on the arrogant, dismissive way he waved it around like a meaningless prop. It was fixed on the man who had just declared her illiterate. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. Her voice when it came was quiet, but it sliced through the humid night air with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She did not address Julian Croft. Instead, she turned her gaze to the two Spanish architects. Señores Castillo, she began, and the sound of her own voice, speaking with an authority she hadn't used in years, was a shock even to her. Con su permiso, with your permission. The brothers stared at her, their surprise evident. Her accent was not the tentative Spanish of a second-language learner. It was flawless, pure Castilian, imbued with a formal cadence that was startlingly familiar to them. Croft let out an incredulous snort. What is this? The help has an opinion? Maya ignored him, her focus unbroken. Mr. Croft is mistaken, she said, switching back to a calm, measured English. It is not a simple document, and I can, in fact, read it. She took a step forward, a breach of every rule of service protocol. And with all due respect, gentlemen, you should not sign it. The audacity of her statement hung in the air, electric. The two lawyers looked at Croft in panic, as if a time bomb had just been activated. Candace's perfectly shaped jaw dropped. Julian Croft's face, which had been a mask of smug amusement, slowly began to harden, the color rising in his neck. What did you just say? He growled, his voice low and dangerous. I said, Maya repeated, her voice gaining strength, that they should not sign it. She met his furious gaze without flinching. You said the Spanish was a direct translation. It is not. Mateo Castillo leaned forward, His eyes narrowed with intense interest. "Señorita," he said in Spanish, "please explain." And so she began. It was as if a dam inside her had burst. The years of suppressed knowledge, the lessons from her abuela, the pain of her family's ruin, all flowed out in a torrent of lucid, irrefutable analysis. Under Article 3, the project timeline clause, she began, pointing to a section of the document which she could see upside down from where she stood. The English version states that any delays caused by unforeseeable municipal permitting issues will result in a mutually agreed-upon extension. She paused, then looked directly at the brothers. The Spanish text is different. It uses the phrase cualquier retraso independientemente de su origen. Any delay, regardless of its origin. This means if your design team is a single day late, for any reason, a health issue, a creative reconsideration, you are in breach and subject to the penalties outlined in Article 7. The color drained from Ricardo's face. He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the lines she had indicated. Furthermore, Maya continued, her confidence building with every word. Article 5, Intellectual Property Rights. The English version grants Mr. Croft's corporation the rights to the architectural designs for this specific project. The Spanish version grants his corporation derechos a perpetuidad sobre todos los diseños, conceptos y materiales asociados. Perpetual rights over all designs, concepts, and associated materials. She took a breath. That means he would own not just the blueprints for this building, but potentially the core design concepts your firm has developed over 50 years. He could use them for any project he wishes, anywhere in the world, without further compensation. He would, in effect, own a piece of your family's soul. Mateo let out a soft, sharp exhale, as if he'd been punched. He and his brother exchanged a look of horrified understanding. Julian Croft was no longer looking amused. He was staring at Maya, his expression a mixture of fury and dawning confusion. He turned to his lawyers. "Is this true?" he hissed. The two young men were sweating profusely, shuffling their papers, unable to meet his eyes. "Mr. Croft, it's aggressive but standard practice for risk mitigation," one of them stammered. "I didn't ask for your risk mitigation strategy," Croft boomed, his voice cracking like a whip. "I asked you if what she's saying is true." Maya wasn't finished. She felt a righteous, incandescent anger fueling her, the anger of her father, the wisdom of her grandmother. "The most dangerous part," she said, her voice dropping, drawing them all in, "is in the final section, the dispute resolution clause. The English text specifies arbitration in a neutral venue, here in Miami, standard procedure." She locked eyes with Ricardo and Mateo. The Spanish text is a masterpiece of deception. It agrees to arbitration, but invokes a little-known subsection of Spanish commercial law, the subfuero de atracción concursal. It's an obscure clause usually applied in bankruptcy proceedings. It means that if any one of Mr. Croft's hundreds of subsidiary companies, even one completely unrelated to this project, were to declare financial insolvency in a Spanish court, all legal disputes related to this contract would be automatically pulled into that bankruptcy case. Your claims would be frozen for years, tangled in a process you would have no control over. It's a legal poison pill. It makes the entire contract unenforceable from your side. It is not a gesture of goodwill. It is a trap, she finished. The celestial terrace was utterly silent, save for the distant sound of a siren in the city below. The two lawyers looked as if they wanted the marble floor to swallow them whole. Candace was staring at Maya as if she had sprouted a second head. And Julian Croft, he was speechless. The raw, absolute shock on his face was startling. He had built an empire on his ability to read situations, to dominate any room he entered. But he had been rendered powerless. He had brought a bazooka to a gunfight, only to have a quiet girl in an apron reveal that his own weapon was rigged to explode in his face. He had tried to humiliate a waitress, and she had just saved him from committing a catastrophic, deal-destroying act of bad faith in front of the very men he needed to impress. It was Ricardo Castillo who finally broke the spell. He slowly, deliberately tore the letter of intent in half, then in half again, and placed the pieces in the center of the table. He rose from his seat, a man of immense dignity, and walked over to Maya. He took her hand, the hand of a waitress, and bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. "Señorita," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have done our family a service tonight that we can never truly repay. You have honored the memory of your ancestors with your integrity and your sight." He then turned to face the table. "Please," he said, pulling out the chair next to his, "sit with us. This business discussion is over. We would be honored if you would join us for dinner." The invitation was a bomb thrown into the rigid social structure of Solstice. A server dining with the guests. It was heresy. But before Maya could stammer a refusal, Julian Croft found his voice. It was a hoarse, strained sound, stripped of all its earlier arrogance. "What?" he asked, his slate blue eyes fixed on her, no longer with contempt, but with a terrifying, piercing intensity. "Is your name?" "My name," she said, her voice clear and strong, finally reclaiming it for herself, "is Maya Flores." The name Maya Flores meant nothing to Julian Croft or his entourage, but to the Castillo brothers, it was simply the name of their savior. Ricardo's gesture of tearing the contract was a definitive end to the business portion of the evening. The tension that had crackled in the air dissipated, replaced by a strange, stunned calm. Ricardo's invitation for Maya to sit was not a suggestion. It was a statement. He looked directly at Julian Croft, his expression making it clear that their future relationship depended entirely on how he handled this next moment. Croft, a man who processed risk and reward in milliseconds, understood. The Castillo deal was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, not to mention the immense prestige. Humiliating Maya further was a liability he could no longer afford. In fact, she had just become his single greatest asset in the room. He swallowed his pride, a bitter pill, and gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," he managed to say through gritted teeth. "Please, join us." Maya hesitated, a lifetime of ingrained service industry rules screaming at her. She could feel Mr. Klein's horrified gaze from the edge of the terrace. But then she looked at the two kind, grateful faces of the Castillo brothers, and she thought of her abuela. Elena would never have backed down. With a deep breath, Maya untied the strings of her apron. She folded the crisp black fabric, the symbol of her servitude, of her invisibility, and laid it carefully on her empty serving tray. It felt like shedding a skin. Then, with a dignity she hadn't felt in years, she walked to the table and took the seat between Ricardo and Mateo. One of Croft's lawyers, desperate to recalibrate to the new power dynamic, scrambled to pull the chair out for her. The act was so jarringly out of sync with the evening's events that it was almost comical. The dinner that followed was one of the most surreal experiences of Maya's life. The business talk was abandoned. Instead, prompted by Ricardo's gentle questions, Maya found herself speaking about her grandmother. She told them about Elena's legendary career in Madrid, her reputation for being able to smell a bad clause from a mile away. She shared anecdotes her abuela had told her about famous cases, of corporate titans and their legal follies. She spoke of her father, of his trust and his ruin, explaining how a single predatory contract had destroyed their family. As she spoke, she wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the keeper of her family's story, the inheritor of a powerful legacy. The Castillo brothers listened, enthralled. They understood her story not as a tale of pity, but as a cautionary fable about the importance of honor and diligence in a world that often valued neither. Croft and his side of the table were largely silent. Candace was utterly lost, tapping away at her phone under the table, bored and irrelevant. The lawyers ate their food with the grim focus of men on death row. But Croft was listening. He wasn't hearing the story with empathy. He was processing it as data. He was a man who hated being blindsided. His own legal team had not only drafted a contract that was insulting to the Castillos, but they had also failed to inform him of its most aggressive provisions. They had exposed him, made him look like a fool and a cheat. He had come here tonight to conquer, and he had nearly been defeated by his own army's incompetence. The girl he had dismissed as a nobody had seen the landmines his own highly paid experts had either planted or overlooked. "This contract that ruined your father," Mateo said, his voice rumbling with quiet anger. "The men who drafted it, who deceived him, were they ever held accountable?" Maya shook her head, a familiar ache in her chest. "No," she said softly. They were a subsidiary of a massive international conglomerate, a company called Titan Global Properties. My father tried to fight them, but they buried him in legal fees. We had no resources. By the time it was over, we had nothing left. At the mention of Titan Global Properties, Julian Croft's head snapped up. His eyes, which had been watching Maya with a detached, analytical curiosity, now sharpened with a new predatory light. The pieces of a much larger puzzle were slamming into place in his mind. Titan Global Properties was not just some abstract name to him. They were his primary competitor, a ruthless global entity that had outmaneuvered him on 3 major international deals in the past 2 years. Their tactics were notoriously savage, their legal department a labyrinth from which few opponents emerged unscathed. Titan was the shark that was even bigger than him, and he despised them with a cold, professional fury. Suddenly, the dinner was no longer about the Castillo deal. It was about something far more tantalizing, an opportunity, a weapon, a way to strike at his greatest enemy. Ricardo Castillo, oblivious to the silent calculations flashing through Croft's brain, reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on Maya's arm. "What happened to your family was a grave injustice," he said with conviction. He then turned his clear, steady gaze upon Julian Croft. "Mr. Croft," Ricardo said, his voice losing its dinner party warmth and taking on the cool, hard edge of business. "We came to Miami to build something beautiful with a partner we could trust. Honor, for my brother and me, is not a sentimental notion. It is the foundation upon which everything else is built." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Tonight, you failed a test of honor, but this young woman has given you an opportunity to redeem it." The implication was as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. It was an ultimatum. The Castillo deal was no longer about zoning permits and profit margins. It was now inextricably linked to the ghost of a dead man's honor and the future of the Waitress Croft had tried to destroy. Julian Croft was cornered, and he realized with a jolt of ice-cold clarity that the most powerful person on the terrace was not him, with his billions and his skyscrapers, but the quiet, unassuming young woman sitting across from him. The chessboard had been completely reset. Julian Croft, the king, was in check, and the move had been made by a pawn. He saw the path forward with the brutal clarity that had made him a billionaire. The Castillo brothers were not just offering him a chance at redemption, they were handing him a justification for war, a war he already wanted to fight. He leaned forward, dropping all pretense. The polished veneer of the corporate host dissolved, revealing the focused, lethal predator beneath. This was Croft in his natural element. "Mr. Castillo," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum of controlled power. "What was done to the Flores family was not an injustice. It was an act of corporate warfare. And Titan Global Properties is not just an unethical competitor. They are a disease." He then turned his full, undivided attention to Maya. The look in his eyes was no longer contemptuous or even calculating. It was something else entirely. Recognition. He was looking at a weapon, and he intended to wield it. "Miss Flores," he stated, "you said your family lacked the resources to fight. That is a problem we can solve." He steepled his fingers. "I have a standing feud with Titan. They operate in the shadows using shell corporations and legal mazes. To fight them, you need more than a good lawyer. You need an army. I have that army. The most savage litigators, the most tenacious forensic accountants, the most unscrupulous private investigators money can buy." He was offering her the full, terrifying might of his empire. He was offering to aim his financial sledgehammer at the company that had destroyed her life. "We will not just seek damages for your family," he declared, his voice filled with a cold, thrilling venom. "We will launch a full-scale legal assault. We will audit every deal they've ever made. We will subpoena every record. We will find every corner they have ever cut, every rule they have ever bent, every family they have ever ruined. We will make it so expensive for them to exist that their shareholders will revolt. We will not just seek justice for your father. We will burn their empire to the ground." The offer was staggering, both in its generosity and its sheer viciousness. Maya felt a dizzying vertigo. This man, her tormentor from an hour ago, was now offering her the one thing she had dreamed of but never thought possible. Retribution. But it was a poisoned chalice, justice delivered by a man who saw it not as a moral crusade, but as a strategic acquisition. Ricardo and Mateo watched Croft, their faces impassive. They had set the stage for this test, and Croft was responding with overwhelming, terrifying force. It was not the response of a penitent man, but of a warlord who had just been given a righteous cause to rally his troops. "Why?" Maya asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. She was not so naive as to believe this was about her. A thin, humorless smile touched Croft's lips. He appreciated her directness. "Transparency is efficiency," he said. "Titan Global has cost me close to $1 billion in lost opportunities. Crippling them is a sound business objective, one I would pursue regardless. The fact that this path begins with rectifying the crime committed against your family," he glanced at the Castillo brothers, "and in doing so, demonstrates my own character's capacity for course correction, makes this an exceptionally synergistic endeavor. Your cause gives my war a moral justification. You are the perfect casus belli." There it was. Cold, transactional, and brutally honest. He was not her champion. She was his excuse. Maya looked from Croft's predatory gaze to the solemn faces of the Castillos. They had opened this door for her. They had used their leverage to give her a voice, and now this terrible, powerful weapon was being offered to her. Could she use it, knowing the motives of the man who held it? For her father's name, for her abuela, who deserved to live her last years with peace and security, their family honor restored. She thought of her father, a good man swallowed by sharks. He would have despised Julian Croft, but he would have fought for the truth until his last breath. This was her fight now. She couldn't win it with quiet dignity and painful memories. She needed a battering ram. Julian Croft was offering her one the size of a skyscraper. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice ringing with newfound resolve. A wolfish grin spread across Croft's face. The deal was back on. "Everything," he said. "Every document your father saved. Every memory you have. Every detail your grandmother ever told you." He snapped his fingers. One of his lawyers jolted to attention, fumbled for his phone. "Get Eleanor Vance on the phone, head of my litigation department. Tell her to cancel her vacation in the Alps. We're going to war." The rest of the dinner was a council of war. The exquisite food Maya would normally serve was brought out, but it was consumed distractedly. Over lobster and fine wine, Maya, Croft, and the Castillos mapped out the opening salvos of their campaign against Titan Global Properties. Candace sat in a bubble of silent incomprehension, a beautiful ornament in a room now crackling with high-stakes purpose. When the evening concluded, Croft stood. He looked at Maya, who was no longer his waitress, but his strange new ally. "My car will take you home, Miss Flores," he said. It was a statement, not an offer. "Thank you, Mr. Croft, but I prefer the bus," she replied. It was a small act of defiance, a quiet declaration that she was his partner in this, not his employee. Ricardo Castillo smiled. "Nonsense, my dear," he said warmly. "Mateo and I will see you home. We insist." It was a gesture of protection, a clear signal to Croft that she was under their care. As Maya walked off the celestial terrace, flanked by the two courtly Spanish architects, she glanced back. Julian Croft was on his phone, his back to the stunning view, his silhouette dark against the glittering city lights. His face was alive with the thrill of the hunt. He had come to Solstice to acquire a piece of land. He was leaving with a far more complex prize, a righteous cause, a bitter rival to destroy, and an alliance with the one person who had dared to tell him he was wrong. The game had changed, and Maya Flores was no longer a pawn. She was the queen. The days that followed were a blur of radical transformation. Maya's life split into two distinct, jarring realities. By night, she still donned the black apron at Solstice, moving through the familiar ballet of service. Mr. Klein now treated her with a terrified deference, unsure of what she had become, but certain she was no longer just a waitress. The other servers watched her with a mixture of awe and suspicion, whispering about the night she had been escorted home by billionaires. By day, her small bungalow in Little Havana became the forward operating base for the war against Titan Global. Julian Croft, true to his word, unleashed his legal army. The team was led by Eleanor Vance, a woman as sharp and formidable as her name suggested, with a reputation for eviscerating corporate giants in the courtroom. She and her team of forensic accountants and investigators descended upon Maya's life. They didn't treat her as a victim, they treated her as the star witness, the primary source of intelligence. They spent days with her, carefully digitizing her father's old files, creating a timeline of the betrayal. Maya, in turn, dredged up every lesson her abuela had ever taught her. She pointed out the subtle inconsistencies in the original contract, the deliberate ambiguity in the phrasing that a normal lawyer might miss, but which, to her trained eye, screamed of malicious intent. She was no longer just recalling memories. She was providing expert testimony. Croft remained a powerful remote presence. He never visited the bungalow, but he was a constant stream of encrypted texts and curt phone calls, directing the strategy with the detached precision of a general moving pieces on a map. For him, this wasn't personal. It was a complex problem with a desirable outcome. The first major breakthrough came from the forensic accounting team. By cross-referencing international banking records, a feat made possible by Croft's immense financial leverage, which persuaded certain offshore banks to be cooperative. They found it. A series of wire transfers from a shell corporation owned by Titan Global to another shell corporation owned by one of her father's original partners. It was the payment for his betrayal, the 30 pieces of silver hidden under layers of corporate obfuscation. It was the smoking gun. Armed with this, Eleanor Vance's team moved swiftly. They didn't file a lawsuit immediately. That was too public, too slow. Croft's method was more direct. He arranged a negotiation. The meeting was held in a sterile, soundproof boardroom on the top floor of Croft's downtown tower. On one side of the massive granite table sat Maya, flanked by the formidable Eleanor Vance and the Castillo brothers, who had flown back in to show their unwavering support. On the other side sat the board members of Titan Global Properties, summoned under the pretense of discussing a potential merger, an offer Croft had fabricated to get them all in one room. They were confident, arrogant, the masters of their universe. Croft sat at the head of the table, a picture of calm, predatory power. He let Eleanor Vance speak. With the dispassionate air of a scientist presenting a proof, she laid out the evidence. She detailed the fraudulent contract. She presented the banking records of the secret payments. She revealed sworn affidavits from other contractors Titan had defrauded using similar methods, witnesses Croft's investigators had unearthed from around the globe. It was not an accusation, it was an execution. The arrogance on the faces of the Titan board members slowly melted away, replaced by a pasty gray fear. They were trapped. A public lawsuit would not only expose their fraud, but it would also trigger SEC investigations and a catastrophic collapse in their stock price. Croft let the silence hang in the air for a full minute, savoring their panic. Then he spoke, his voice quiet, almost gentle. "Here is my offer," he said. "You will issue a full, public apology to the Flores family. You will create a restitution fund of $50 million for the families your company has defrauded, the disbursement of which will be overseen by an independent administrator." He paused. "And you will sell me your South American Development Division, all of it, your land holdings, your construction contracts, your permits, for $1. It was utter annihilation. He wasn't just demanding justice. He was carving up their empire and taking the choicest piece for himself. They had no choice. They agreed. A week later, the story exploded across the financial world, framed not as a scandal, but as a bold act of corporate activism. The headlines read, "Julian Croft forces rival Titan Global to create $50 million victim restitution fund." The articles mentioned a key case, the fraudulent deception of the Flores family, which had brought the company's predatory practices to light. The Vance name was never used, but the Flores name was cleared, their story told, their honor restored. For Maya, it was like the sun coming out after a decade-long storm. She sat with her abuela, who was having a rare day of lucidity, and read the articles aloud. A tear traced a path through the wrinkles on Elena's cheek, a tear of sorrow and of pride. The weight that had been crushing Maya's family for years had finally, blessedly lifted. The day after the news broke, a sleek black car, the same one from that fateful night, appeared outside her bungalow. The driver held the door. This time, Maya got in without hesitation. She met Julian Croft on the same celestial terrace at solstice. The restaurant was closed. He had booked the entire place for them. The table was set for two. "The Castillo brothers have signed the final partnership agreement," he said, handing her a glass of champagne. They insisted on a new clause. The floor clause, they're calling it. It stipulates that all contracts in all languages must be personally vetted and approved by you. Maya blinked, stunned. "Me?" "You," he confirmed. He looked out at the city, his city. "I do not like being made a fool of, Miss Flores. My legal team was incompetent. They saw the words, but they didn't understand the language of the fight. You do. You have a skill that I have learned to value." He turned to face her, his expression uncharacteristically direct. "I am expanding my operations globally, Europe, Asia, South America. I am acquiring companies with long histories, complex legal structures. I need a navigator, someone who can read the maps and see the devils in the details." He was offering her a job, not just any job, but a position of immense power and responsibility, a role created specifically for her unique talents. She would be his final checkpoint, the guardian of his empire's integrity, not out of morality, but out of a shared understanding of the brutal mechanics of power. "I am creating a new division," he continued, "strategic contract analysis. You will run it. You will report directly to me. You will have unlimited resources and a staff of your choosing. Your starting salary will be enough to ensure your grandmother has the best medical care in the world for the rest of her life." Maya looked at this man, a force of nature who had nearly crushed her, and who was now offering her the world. She thought of the starched apron, the condescending looks, the gnawing anxiety of her old life, and she thought of her abuela, whose legacy she could now carry forward, not as a burden of memory, but as a shield and a sword. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and unwavering. "I accept, Mr. Croft," she said, "on two conditions." A flicker of surprise and perhaps respect showed in his eyes. "Name them." "First," she said, "my division will have the authority to veto any deal, for any reason. No appeals." A slow smile spread across Julian Croft's face. It was the first genuine smile she had ever seen on him. "Agreed. It will keep my other departments honest." "What's the second condition?" "You and I will have dinner, right here once a year," Maya said, "and you will tell me the story of one person whose life was made better by what we build. Not a shareholder, not an executive, a person, a family, and you had better be telling the truth." She held his gaze. "Because I will know if you're lying." Croft stared at her for a long moment, the city lights reflected in his cold blue eyes. He had come here seeking a partner in conquest, but he had found something far more valuable. He had found a conscience with teeth. "Deal, Miss Flores," he said, raising his glass. "Deal." He had come for a piece of land, but he had gained a queen, and Maya Flores, the poor waitress who couldn't even read the receipt, had not just reclaimed her family's honor. She had discovered that the most powerful language in the world was not Spanish or English, but the unwavering truth, spoken with courage in a room full of powerful men. And she was, at last, fluent.